Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Masters Interviews. Which, if you don't know what that is, it's a podcast-style chat with somebody else from the hobby, usually more experienced and interesting than I am, who can delve into a wealth of stories and experience to share with newer gamers. The idea of getting people on like this is to help people like me who are sort of intermediate or beginners get some of their questions answered, basically. And I'm absolutely chuffed to say that joining us for this edition, all the way from Australia, is none other than Old Wargamer. is what his Twitter handle is. But it is, in fact, Steve. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm well, buddy.
Remind us of your surname again, Steve.
The surname's Wold, W-O-L-D, which I actually think is an old English word.
Wold, W-O-L-L.
Wold, W-O-L-D. Gold with the W.
Wold. Oh, I think it might be, as in South Wold type places.
Or as it, I think it means rolling hills and woods or something. But then again, it's got German connotations and Norwegian connotations as well.
Yeah. So lots and lots of people will know Stephen from his at Old Wargamer Twitter handle, which is an absolute machine. It is and it's probably one of the ways if you're into wargaming, you're on Twitter, you will come across Stephen. I can't see how you wouldn't. And he's famous for fantastic games and a brilliant games room he's got in Australia. And he's also famous for being generally a sort of helpful and friendly voice in the Twitter community for all wargamers. He's certainly helped me a lot with a lot of encouragement and words of advice, and I'm sure he's helped hundreds of other people, either directly or indirectly. So welcome, Stephen. Let's kick things off. How we do with most people when we do these interviews is tell us a little bit about, firstly, exactly where you live at the moment. So where are you speaking to us from?
I'm speaking to you from Adelaide, South Australia. I live just outside of the city of Adelaide. It's a rural area, nice, lovely green rolling hills, sheep in the paddock. I've got about 3 acres, not a lot of land, but just enough to give me peace of mind.
Thinking about putting some.
Yeah, enough to fight a battle on, yes. maybe put some grapes in. I don't know. But now that I've just retired, I've got a couple of acres that I can play with and start to do some stuff with. So, yeah, we live in an ideal area of Australia.
Brilliant. Now, tell everybody about how you started in the hobby then. Why did you first pick up a miniature? When did you first?
I reckon I'm part of that Airfix generation, and
not the first person to say that, actually. Yeah.
No, it's surprising when you do think about it, and like you, I've heard many people refer to this as well through podcasts. But Airfix had a tremendous influence on young people of back in the early 70s. In fact, I can remember walking down the street in Blacktown, which was a suburb of Sydney, in the western suburbs, with my mum, and we would go past the chemist or the pharmacy of all places, and in the back of the chemist, the pharmacist had a shelf where he had packets of Airfix soldiers for sale. Now, this is completely weird, but we didn't really have in our little towns back then dedicated toy shops like we do now. It was always just something that was tacked on. And here we had a chemist who was obviously a miniature enthusiast and decided that he would sell these soldiers, and he had the whole Airfix collection. And we would go in there, and my mum would buy us, my brother and I, she'd buy us a packet of whatever it was that we wanted. And so that was a real highlight for us growing up, was to be able to make sure we railroaded her to the chemist so we'd get another packet of Airfix soldiers.
So how old were you when you first started painting those then?
I reckon I would have been anywhere from 10 through to 13.
Sure.
So, yeah, I was pretty young. This was probably very early 70s. But so Airfix figures were huge for me. They were really the only small miniatures that were available at the time. Metal miniatures were still really hard to come by, especially where I was, and hard to access. In fact, I had no concept in my mind about a metal miniature until I was well into my teens and was looking around and stumbled across a brochure from somebody or a leaflet, because obviously the internet wasn't around then, so you couldn't just go and look up what you wanted. You had to. The only way you found anything out was if you received a catalogue, or a friend said to you, "Look at this picture," and out in a magazine and things like that. So that's where I started to learn that there was a world beyond Airfix miniatures.
Sure. Okay. And then to the present day, then, and you, like I said, most people will come across you, or there'll be lots of people that know you from, well, the Twitter handle, I suppose, the @old wargamer Twitter handle. How just briefly, because that's how lots of people will recognise you. How long ago did you set that up, and how many followers you got now? It's a crazy number, isn't it, for a wargame stream? What is it? Is it like 5,000 or something crazy? Or
it is. We've just hit the 5,000 mark, 5,100 and something.
What wargamer on Twitter has 5,000 followers?
Well, there's a few actually. I think there are some guys that are far more talented than me, especially in the painting area, and they have some very, very good followers, and especially in the 40K community too. There's some people that have some quite impressive numbers, and the D&D community.
Yeah.
So I joined Twitter probably, I think it was 11 years ago now, when I look at my homepage, and I did it when I was working in, I was running a part of the organisation I worked for. It was in vocational education, and I had a team of about 30 very, very creative people.
Yeah.
People like yourself, people who are into videoing and editing, and who were designers and craftsmen, and they would design educational programs for training. So one of the young guys said to me, social media is going to be this huge thing, you need to get yourself into it. And Facebook had really only just begun, and Twitter was there, and these things were all starting up. And so he signed me up into Twitter, and and I just started plodding along with it then. And so it's been 11 years, and it's been an interesting journey to watch how Twitter's developed and how social media have developed, and how that's influenced our hobby tremendously.
Am I right in thinking that Twitter is the main way you communicate in the hobby through social media? Is that fair to say? Is that
yeah, you're absolutely. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So, I mean, you don't have an Instagram account that I'm aware of or anything like that, do you? Or if you do,
I don't.
You're not active on it.
I don't, and I don't. I do post occasionally. There's a couple of decent Facebook groups. There's a medieval one which I like, and I think there's a Napoleonic one. And if I do something in those eras, I'll often
stick
just put a couple of photos of.
Yeah.
But I for me, and I find that I need to only have a couple of social media things. It becomes very all-absorbing. If I have I mean, there must be a dozen I could be posting stuff on, but they become all-absorbing and so time-consuming to be able to go from. What we need is someone to design an app that when you put a post into the app, it automatically populates every social media platform for you.
I think there are some that do that. There are some that do that, but I think that I've tried some of them in the past, but there's always one platform that doesn't quite work on it. So for that reason, people design stuff that doesn't quite work. Yeah. Somebody would correct me in the comments, I'm sure. So no, this definitely works. But anyway, so one of the interesting ways I think that you use Twitter is you're very very interactive with it. I think you're very good with it, actually, because I think you possibly, because the first time I bought a miniature and painted it, as in a historical Wargames miniature, I just took a picture of it, went, "Oh, first tweet, just made a miniature," and I think that you were possibly one of the first people I remember, if I remember actually. So I think you might have even retweeted it. So you is that a deliberate thing that you're quite supportive of sort of newcomers and people who are learning stuff, and is that a conscious thing?
Yeah, look, it has been a conscious thing. I sat back and watched how the Twitter community worked for a little while, and you'll probably see this yourself as you look at the amount of followers that people have on Twitter. There's usually, they try to have a lot of followers, but then they follow very little people. And so, and it seems to be all about them. And I thought, well, you know, back then at the beginning, I wanted people to see what I was doing. I wanted people to notice that I was a painter and I had something to share. I wanted to get into that community, but everybody was really, they wouldn't retweet unless it was really, really something that they thought was exceptional. It was all about getting them followers, not them following somebody. And I just thought, I want to try something different.
It's a really interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
I want to be more embracing of people out there. I want to retweet more. In fact, I did get some criticism in my early days from a couple of very established people on Twitter that I was retweeting too much. And my comment was, look, when you come across somebody that's just starting, the best thing you can do is to get their material out in front of other people so that they can get the feedback and they start to feel good about what they're doing. And it actually, when you post a photograph and you get 2 or 3 or 5 likes, and you know, that's good, but when somebody retweets it and all of a sudden the 5 goes up to 25 because you've given it to a wider audience, the motivation that brings to that newcomer is absolutely tremendous.
Yeah.
And that's my philosophy.
Yeah.
I want to help people get a wider audience. And
that's really funny you should say that. Yeah. Just
if
because
we all did that, if we all stopped, if we all followed each other as war gamers and promoted each other and built each other up, the community would look even different again. I mean, it is a very, very supportive community as it is, but I noticed, especially within the 40K scene and the Dungeons and Dragons scene, because they're all interconnected in different ways, there is a lot of, it's about trying to build a personality and you are the king and people must follow you. Well, I don't subscribe to that. I'll follow just about anybody. But if anyone follows me, I 99.9% of the time follow them back.
Yeah.
Because I just think, let's build each other up.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, and it's partly why I started this YouTube channel is because the thing with, well, I suppose when I'm like taking pictures of stuff and sticking it on there and thinking, well, it's nice when people say they like my stuff and all that sort of stuff, but ultimately, what am I providing other people other than just some nice pictures to go, oh, they're nice? So, and I thought that, like we were talking before we started the recording for people listening's benefit, that I think there's a bit of a gap there in the amount of support for people who are new and that kind of thing, particularly in historicals. I'm not talking about GW, because if you want help to get into GW and you want to find a community, they've got it nailed. But for if you're not really into GW, but you're really into models and war games, it's actually quite hard to get started if you don't have a club near you that's got your mates in it. That's my opinion.
Totally agree.
No,
you're spot on.
Yeah. So that's the difference between historical and GW. Is GW have got this big infrastructure that's all designed at getting people in the hobby, their hobby, only their hobby. Fair enough.
Yep.
And historicals where everything's completely, one-man bands and fractured, and there's no system, there's no association or worldwide association or anything like that. We're not saying there should be, but that's the downside to it, I suppose. Anyway,
you could call me a wargaming evangelist if you want, but that's because
wrong with that.
I really love this hobby. I think this hobby has such a tremendous amount of positive qualities to it that will help anybody in a range of different ways. And so I'm quite keen to get that out there and to help other people get established in it so they can experience this.
Sure. Do you think that, to phrase it differently, what would your advice be to somebody like me before I properly got into it, because now I'm fine. It's taken me a while, but now I'm part of a group and I've built a board and I've stuck at it, and I've found my sort of stream of patience, if you like, to get through it, and I've become, and I love it more and more now. I've stuck at it. What would you say to people who have got those barriers in front of them, which we all know about, which is, if you're going to get into historicals or GW, then you've got to buy the stuff, you've got to probably assemble it, you've then got to paint it, and then you've got to learn some rules, and it's nothing like picking up a computer game with a tutorial attached to it, or almost any other hobby, really. There's this real investment in it. What would you say to somebody who looks at the games and the models and the setups and thinks, this is amazing, I want to do it, but I am terrified and I'm intimidated by it? You know, how would you tell someone to approach that, overcome that?
Look, I just think we would approach it the same way we would approach anything. Even a new computer game, you would get in and you would very tentatively start to work your way through that game, and until you got familiar with the character, familiar with the layout, familiar with the instructions and how the thing worked. Wargaming is no different. It's about just starting somewhere and finding a miniature or set of miniatures that really pushes your buttons and getting it and having a go. We are human beings. We're still very tactile, and we love to touch things and feel things and experience things. And we get that whole 3D sensation by having those models in front of us. And that creates a totally different experience than what you can have on a screen. And you can bring those things to life and put them together. And so the very first thing I would say is just get something and start to touch and feel it and play with it. Experience it. Like I mentioned about the Airfix kits, and Airfix soldiers. Well, the very first metal miniatures I had, I think, were from a company called, I think it was Grendel. I think they're a very old fantasy company. Or was it Grenadier? Grendel or Grenadier? I can't remember. But I saw this box and it was a box of miniatures that was marketed towards the Dungeons and Dragons community, which back then was really, really odd. But these guys put out these metal miniatures, and some of them were knights and some of them were orcs, I think. And I had never, and they were nice, big, chunky, like 28mm miniatures. And all I'd had is these little thin Airfix miniatures of plastic. And all of a sudden I held my first metal miniature, and man, just the weight, the sensation, the detail, the quality of it, it opened my mind to what you can actually do with this hobby. So I'd say just do that. Find something that is pushing your buttons, and there's heaps out there now, and it probably will be a Games Workshop product because there's just so much of their stuff which is just beautiful. But if it's historical, there are some fantastic miniatures out there as well. Find what you want and just start to touch it and feel it and play with it and paint it. And get that experience. It will grow from there.
Yeah, sure. Do you think that it's actually in some ways, well, this came up with Ken Ryder Yorkshire game, and it's been another Masters interview, but this came up with do you think there's actually too much choice? Because that's what some people have said to me now, that they worry that there's now too many manufacturers, there's too many lines for too many periods. There are too many rolling different types of rule sets that come out all the time. And that can create a kind of sort of saturation confusion effect where there's just too many places to turn. So you almost, you can't see the wood for the trees, and you've got everything, but you end up completing nothing. So are we at that point where there's too much stuff?
I think we're really close to that point. And I've been through this only through the last few years, and you describe it perfectly, where I had to just say because they all want you to buy my product. Here's a new game. Here's a new miniature. And when you've got 50 different companies all trying to get you to do that, and in social media you get swamped by the advertisements and emails and stuff from these different manufacturers, it can be overwhelming. But it's contextualize it. It's no different to you going to the supermarket and seeing the same product, but from a dozen different manufacturers, and you've got to choose one.
Yeah.
I just had to have a little talk with myself and say, you don't have to keep up with this. You don't have to have everything. In fact, when you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing. So, or completing nothing. And I looked at some of my collections, and I had bits of this and bits of that, and I'd been in this cycle where something I'd want to get it and I'd like it, but then I would never complete it. It'd be put in a drawer or a box or hidden away.
Yeah.
I had to stop myself doing that, and I said,
okay,
what are the periods that I want to do? What are the armies I want to collect? What am I really interested in, and what do I want to see through to completion?
Sure.
And so.
So you had to make that transition. You kind of had to change your mindset fully.
I did. Otherwise, but we do this all the time. You know, we live in this world where we are bombarded by advertisements, and the number each day is staggering. And it's amazing that we can even friggin' function at all with the amount of publicity and advertising that hits us to buy people's products all the time. But we do this every day. We filter and we sort out. And it's just about taking that skill that you will learn and you use every day to make a decision about what it is you're going to buy. You apply that same skill to this hobby. And that's something that you have to do now. You have to say, I've decided to go with this manufacturer for this period, and I'm going to stick with that and just leave it with that. But with this period, I maybe will go with this company because I like what they... So because you've still got lots of choice, but you don't have to buy everything from everybody. Just breathe, look at what there is, and decide what it is that you want to see to completion.
Sure. I think that's really good advice. I think one of the reasons that I've not got fed up is that I don't know how or why I did it, but I've decided really early that Wars of the Roses was going to be my thing. And that was always going to be the end goal, was to have this big Wars of the Roses collection, and anything else would be a little...
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've done some Saxons recently. I did one little World War II army, and then I went straight back towards the Roses kind of thing. So yeah, and I don't regret that at all for not butterflying around too much and trying too many things. And
no, I think that's perfect. That is perfect, because you're still your main thing. Yes, you've dabbled, but your main thing you keep coming back to, and I think that's important. And to be perfectly honest, I think that's the way that we all build armies. It is quite unusual for somebody just to say, I'm a War of the Roses gamer or collector, and that's all you ever do from go to woe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The hobby doesn't work that way. There are things that are exciting and that do take your attention, and it's okay to have a brief foray here and there. You know, like you might put a small 8-man squad together for chain of command or for bolt action, or you might do something because someone's doing some sharps practice and you want a smaller Napoleonic group. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's part of this hobby and a normal part of this hobby. But it's when that becomes overwhelming and you feel like you've got to have something from every period, every miniature, every manufacturer, that it just becomes too much.
Yeah.
So you go back to that main thing you do something, you dabble, you come back to your main period, and you whack another few units out, and that grows, and you just keep chugging away like that. That's very normal.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing I noticed was that I came fairly early on and became aware of the concept of the pile of shame as well. I was like, what is this pile of shame? And just started Googling it and stuff, and you see some, fairly early on, I saw some pictures that people had taken of, a spare room or something, or a garage or whatever, that is, like floor to ceiling rammed with unpainted miniatures. And I just thought, oh my God, I don't want that to be me. I didn't think that.
And, I guess that's one of the things we've learned in this hobby is, like anything else, this hobby attracts such a wide range of people, and people get into this hobby for lots of different reasons. And recently, living in a small city like Adelaide, population of, 1 million people roughly, and I belong to a wargaming club where there's probably between 50 and 70 members. Working in this shop, I've discovered there are hundreds of people who love figures and who buy figures and who paint figures, but they're not all members of clubs. Because the club side and the gaming side is not for them. They're collectors.
Yeah.
And so these guys that have huge collections, they're collectors.
Yeah.
And so for them, the joy is buying the figures, building an army, but the army is in their head largely. The picture of it completed is in their head, but they could say, this bag here this has got such and such a regiment, and this here is the cavalry, and here's the artillery. They've got it all planned out. They've got all the figures. It's just that they never get to the painting side. They're collectors. Yeah. And then you've got gamers who don't like painting, and they just will buy what they need for that particular game, and they'll get somebody else to paint it. But that's not their thing, so they're just in for the game. And then you've got painters who will still have bits and pieces around the place, but for them it's about painting. This hobby attracts lots of different types of people, and you will soon work out when you're new, what is it? What are you? Are you a hoarder, collector? Nothing wrong with that. Are you more interested in getting down to the nitty-gritties and being a rule umpire and a rule understander and playing those games? Or are you somebody that just wants to sit and dabble and just happy to tinker away, painting a couple of miniatures at a time?
Yeah.
It's a huge, diverse audience that we appeal to here.
Yeah. I mean, the concept of game player or more modeler painter is something that I became aware of fairly early as well. Just out of interest, would you place yourself in either one of those camps? Are you more of a sort of like a painter, modeler, collector person, or do you think you are more of a game player if you had to choose?
I think I've always been more of a painter.
Yeah.
Probably purely for the escapism, I think that brings. I can remember, because I've only just recently retired, but I've always enjoyed the escapism, that being able to go and sit behind my painting desk and just be completely absorbed in what it is that you're doing. You're surrounded by what you're working on. It's usually half a dozen different things at any particular time, and you can just completely lose yourself and focus on that. And it takes you away from work, it takes you away from children, it takes you away from your hassles. So that escapism into that painting realm, I have absolutely loved. I still enjoy games. I still enjoy having games. I still enjoy putting on games. I find them to be quite a lot of work to put on and to host and to make them work well.
They are, aren't they? To set up to think, well, what's the table going to look like? What rules are we going to have? The army lists.
Yeah,
that is a lot of work, isn't it? Yeah,
it is a lot of work.
It's not a 5-minute thing. Yeah,
and I enjoy doing that, but not to the degree that I can lose myself at the painting desk.
Yeah.
So that's always been for me my go-to place to get away. And I guess we all have those sorts of places. Some people might do it on a motorbike or bushwalking or photography or whatever. But for me, that's escapism comes through painting.
Sure. I mean, one question I meant to ask you earlier, we sort of skipped past a bit, was: do you remember what the first army you ever painted was that you completed? And thought,
well, I guess the first,
that's done.
Yeah, the first. Well, there was lots of silly stuff with Airfix figures, but the first metal army I ever finished would have been my 100 Years War medieval army.
Oh, brilliant!
But back in used a lot of Essex miniatures, so we're talking 30 years ago, and Essex miniatures.
Yeah, I've seen those.
They had a great range of medieval figures, and Essex sort of came out on top of some very old miniature companies like Hinchcliffe and Minifig. And while Hinchcliffe and Minifig were nice miniatures for their time, when Essex came out, theirs were just wow. They just had so much personality, and they had different heads on figures, and so it just sort of opened the door to this new world of where miniatures can go. And there was a distributor in Hornsby in Sydney, and of Essex Miniatures, and I got to know him, and I just couldn't help myself. I must have spent a fortune on Essex miniatures and just love them. And that got me really into the hobby in a big way. And their 100 Years War range is, even today, is still, there are some lovely miniatures in there.
Yeah, I've seen some of them. Yeah, I haven't got any of them because they're a little bit out of my sort of sweet spot. I've got no particular reason to own any, if you know what I mean. But they do look really nice. Yeah, but they look well ahead of their time. Like
they were. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. What was the last army you painted then? What was the last army you finished? And how would you compare the two, kind of thing? What's the big differences?
I guess I haven't quite finished yet, but I don't know whether you've seen, I've been working on Persians.
Yeah,
Archimedes Persians.
Yeah. You've been working on those on and off for a while, haven't you?
Yep. Yeah. So I've been working on them. They're not quite finished. I guess, well, I should say my Saxons then, shouldn't I? I should say my Vikings, Saxons and Normans. About 12 months ago, I was talking to one of my wargaming mates, and we have a club open day towards the end of October each year. And we said, well, what are we going to do next year? And I said, I've had Dark Age figures hanging around for a while. I'd really like to finish them. And so we decided that we wanted to do the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Vikings and Saxons, and the Battle of Hastings, Saxons and Normans. So I got my collections out and started painting probably around this time, maybe a month earlier last year, furiously finishing off my Viking army, which I knocked out just before I went to the UK on a holiday in October, November.
Yep.
And then started working on my Saxons, and I finished the Saxon army probably about 2 months ago. After I came back and spent a fortune at War Games Foundry in Nottingham, just supporting your economy.
Yeah, not far from me.
So that army was, I overcooked it as usual. Just made it probably way too big, but I just really loved that whole Dark Age concept. I think that was probably inspired by Bernard Cornwell's novels.
They're great, aren't they? Yeah, they're really good.
He just gives you that period. He captures that period really well. So that Saxon army was the latest army up. How was it different? That's a good question. I look at some of my early 100 Years War photos, and I'll send you a couple of pictures of them. And
please.
So many things have changed in the painting world and in the miniature world. Back when I was painting the 100 Years War figures 30 plus years ago, there wasn't washes and glazes and inks and technical paints and contrast, and there was pretty much Humbrol enamels, and acrylics were still pretty much a new thing. Brushes weren't wonderful. So you get a miniature and you pretty much just start blocking that miniature in. So you paint the uniform, some sort of a flesh colour, pick out the weapon. So it was fairly crude and basic, but for the time, they looked fine. There wasn't a lot of shading. There wasn't a lot of depth to the miniature. The difference now, I painted a lot of my Saxon army actually using contrast paints.
Okay.
So, which I found to be revolutionary when it comes to the time it takes to actually paint a miniature. These guys, one coat, bang, and you're done. So undercoat.
We should explain for the people, the handful of people that won't know what they are. Contrast paints are a range of paints by Games Workshop. Yes. Which I think I don't own any myself, but I've seen them, and my understanding of them is basically the idea being that you can, if you have a set of these paints, you can get a good undercoat that matches that contrast paint and complements that contrast paint. And when you put that contrast paint on the undercoat, it acts a little bit like, it effectively creates 3 or 4 different tones of that one colour, almost creating its own highlight. So it makes it look 3D without you having to put 3 or 4 different shades on. Is that a fair description of how it works?
That's a perfect description. So the paint pools in the recesses of the miniature,
Yep.
It looks dark in those recesses, and it looks lighter and thinner on top of those recesses. So it actually gives it that 3D quality, which is very, very nice.
How does it work for you? Because I've seen a multitude of pictures of miniatures that have been painted by people using contrast paints. I think yours look great, but how did you find that easy to do, or did you have to do a lot of sort of practice with the undercoats? And
Yeah, I did. I did. I mean, it's the same as everything. You've got to put some time and experimentation in it. I started with the contrast on my Persians because the Persians are a very bright army, lots of colour, lots of patterns. And I thought I wanted something that was going to make them pop. And so I started to use the contrast paints, and they fitted perfectly for them. But when I approached the Dark Ages, my perception of the Dark Ages is perhaps the people were a little bit grottier is probably the wrong word, and dirty is probably just a little bit more shabby and drab in the way that their clothing would have been and the way that they would have looked. So starting with a really bright white undercoat and putting your contrast paints straight on top of that was still making the figure look a little bit too
parade ground type.
Yes, a bit polished, which
too bright.
Didn't strike me as the way that they would look. So what I learned to do was that when I used a white undercoat or an off-white undercoat, and you can use greys, you can use a lot of different lighter colours as undercoats, and each different colour you use will give the contrast paint, a different look. So I found a nice off-white that I liked. I then, when that was dry, I would put a coat of or a wash over it, Agrix Earthshade. Got another good old GW product.
Oh yeah. That would
just sit over the miniature lovely, go to the recesses, fill them, give a nice light and shade. So the figure looked dirty when it was dry. White undercoat, Agrix Earthshade. And then I would put the contrast over the top of that.
Oh, I get you. Yeah. Yep.
Now that just worked $1 million for the Dark Age figures. Okay,
that's a good
it gave them that that really drab, grotty look that I was looking for in the figure.
Sure.
So,
So this is getting a bit technical now, but some people understand this. So the thing I've noticed with some people, the way they're using the contrast paints is they can sometimes end up looking very watercolory. Mm-hmm. And I completely get that the point of contrast paints is you're not trying to win a golden demon, you're trying to get stuff painted. but your stuff doesn't look watercolory. Is the Agrax thing, you think, what's doing it?
And I think the other thing with it is just because you've used a contrast paint doesn't preclude that you can go that extra mile if you want to. Like sometimes I will have done a contrast paint on a tunic and it looks really nice, but I think, if I could just highlight that a little bit more with another colour, and that makes it pop even more. So I can do a dry brush over it. I can just pick out with a brighter colour. You can add a couple of extra details if you would like to, and it will make them just even sing more. But the joy of the contrast paints is in the speed, I think, for me.
Would you recommend them for beginners? Like, would you say that they're a good thing to start with?
I really would, because I think they're going to have an effect. The effect that contrast paints can give can make a miniature look like it was painted by somebody that really knows what they were doing instantly. So for a beginner to have that look on a miniature and to have that satisfaction it's done. I mean, look at look at the light and shade in this. It just doesn't look like it's been block painted. It actually looks like someone's gone to some trouble to give it some depth.
Yeah.
So for a new person, the shade that they can use for the flesh makes the flesh look really, really good with one application. And there's a couple of their browns. There's snakebite leather brown, the Gore Gunter fur. Those browns, my God, one application of those just looks so nice and so professional.
And this is an interesting thing for people who are sort of like still getting to know their paints, and they're starting to. Because this is one thing that I've discovered is the way not only different brands of paint behaves, but different shades and tones of paint behave within one line of paints. Is incredible, isn't it?
Very much.
There's something called Vallejo Metal Color Steel, which is actually branded as an airbrush paint, but you can use it on a brush, and it is amazing. It's like colouring in.
Yes,
it's just one coat, and you just wherever you point your brush, it will go, and you won't need another. And I think it's amazing.
I think you've touched on something that's important for beginners, and that is your paint collection will be mixed and varied. I know there are manufacturers that will just want you to use all of their colours, but it won't work that way. You will be able to have a variety of colours from a variety of different manufacturers, and it's about you choosing the colour that you think is working the best for you and that you like. Don't be afraid to have a range of different colours. I think the colours I probably have the biggest collection of are the War Games Foundry paints, where they sell them in three. So you start with a dark base and you work up to a light base. So for a miniature that I was painting a pair of pants on, I would start with let's say a dark red, then it goes to a medium red, then it goes to a light red. And so I get that 3-layered depth on those pants. Contrast paints will give me that in one application.
Sure.
That's the difference.
That's the difference. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So talk briefly about your sort of some of your miniatures and your painting style, Stephen. Stephen is for beginners out there listening to this, or people who are just getting intermediate sort of painting. Stephen is really, really, really good at that Foundry sort of triad system, it's called, where you, like Stephen's just described, you do a base coat, which is kind of like you block in the trousers, then you might do some highlights maybe on the knees or whatever with a slightly lighter colour, and then you do the very top highlight with a brighter colour. And if you're watching this or listen to this rather, then zoom in. We'll bring up some pictures of some of Steve's stuff at this point. And if you sort of zoom in on Steve's stuff, he's really, really clever at picking out where those sort of that second and third highlight should go. And is that something that you've worked on, Stephen? Like, because it looks to me like that you've spent quite a bit of time with distance with your miniatures. So working out, well, if I put that highlight there, that from that distance, that's going to look great, and it'll still look great there. Kind of, do you know what I mean? Is that something that you've spent a bit of time on, or is it just?
I love it.
You know.
Oh no, I love it when you make me sound clever. It's look, I don't think it's any great skill. I like everybody, I learned by looking and by watching, and I think with the Triad Foundry paints, I imagine they've still got them, but they did publish a couple of books on how to use the Foundry paints.
Yeah, they still publish them. Yeah, they do.
So I found that book. Is it Kevin Dallimore?
Kevin Dallimore, yeah.
I found that book when it first came out with the triads, because that was a revolutionary way of painting. I found that to be such a big help. So in a sense, that helped me to see that, well, this is where I should put the highlights. This is how I can make the miniature stand out, by highlighting in these type of areas. And yes, when you've done it a few times, you begin to learn that. And so you approach every miniature with that mindset that you've just learned. But it was a learned skill, as is all of painting. Painting is a learned skill, which means that you don't have to have this innate artist ability. It's just something that will come to you over time. The more you do it and the more you practice, you will get better and better. And I started that way. I started by just doing block painting. I read the book. I looked at pictures online. I followed what they were doing, just copied it. That were used, the pictures that used to come in War Games Illustrated or White Dwarf. And I learned just by doing. It's not being clever. It's just watching and learning.
Sure. Just rounding off this sort of part of the Masters interview, do you have a favourite period? Is there one that you can pick and say? Another person who I asked this the other week basically said, yeah, pretty much whatever the last thing I just painted is my favourite period kind of thing.
It does work like that a bit, yeah. It does work like that because we just look. I guess okay. So if I pick a period, I would say the medieval period. I do love the medieval period, and you live in such a wonderful place to have the history you have around you all the time.
Such a jammy git, I am.
Such a jammy.
Yeah.
I got to fly for 18 hours to be able to see that stuff that you've got around you there, and yet here there is just no depth of history because everything they made was out of wood and was eaten by termites within 12 months. So you've got all those beautiful castles and stuff. So, look, I love the medieval period. I started, like I said, with the 100 Years' War Army. I'm still working now, like you are, on a War of the Roses Army. I've just learned to break that medieval period up I've learned to appreciate the different sections of the medieval period and how armour changed and how tactics changed and then to try to represent those particular aspects in the army you're painting and the weapons they're using and how they fought on the tabletop. I love that. So that's my favourite by far.
I'll tell you another thing I thought the other day, I was thinking of things to ask you, is when you're creating like the little dioramas, sort of the kind of diorama look to some of your bases and things.
Yep.
Do you think you're a bit of a risk taker?
Oh,
I think you are.
I've never seen it as a risk. Tell me why you think it's a risk.
Because you do little things that I just think that I don't see anybody else do, and you'll occasionally pop something in there, and I'll be like, I'm not sure about that. And then I'll think about it and think, no, I'm not sure about that, but I'm bloody glad he did it because it looks cool. Like there's the thing with you had somebody like you had a character raised up on it. I think it might have been Wars Roses. You had somebody raised up on a rock amid his men kind of thing. So he'd found a rock and stood on it.
Yeah. And that was the herald. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, and that's so it's kind of like, well, is that a diorama or is that a unit or what is that? So little things like that. That's not the only thing I've seen you try. So
what's going on in my head? The more I've been in this hobby, and really the more manufacturers release miniatures that have such great animation and motion and movement in them, the more that inspires me to use that in a way that paints a picture. I see each miniature base as being a picture of the time that's being created. Now we've moved, and from the start of the hobby when I was a younger gamer, where you would buy 30 figures and you'd paint them up and you'd have rows of spearmen. So every base would have 3 figures on it and they'd all be the same spearman standing with his spear up straight and shield. And that was the unit. You'd move that forward. Well, manufacturers have started to really give us such beautifully sculpted miniatures that you can start to tell stories with the miniatures. And so with the Saxon army that I just completed, again, War Games Foundry, they have a diorama set, if you want to, of King Harold defeating Harold Hardrada, that's him. So they had a little diorama set, and I thought, wow.
I've not seen that, but that sounds great.
Yeah. So Harold's standing with his foot on a corpse, with his sword up in the air. The moment of victory at the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
I didn't realise that was a kit.
Defeats him.
That's so cool.
Yeah, well, so it comes in the blister pack. I think it's only got about 6 miniatures in it. But one of the guys is beheading somebody. Harold's standing over the corpse. And then I noticed that Gripping Beast had some little vignettes of Dark Age figures that were wrestling and that were fighting, and they're moulded as 2 and sometimes 3 figures all together, and they're very animated. And I thought, what I want to try to do is create a unit that is at that particular time in the battle that Harold won the battle. In other words, they had just burst through the Viking lines. They had captured the Harold. Sorry, too many Harolds in this story. They captured the Viking Harold. They had killed his retainers, and they were in that moment of jubilation when they were in the middle of killing the prisoners, singing the praises of themselves and raising their swords in the air. And I wanted a unit to look like that. And so I set out, and I'll give you some photos of that.
Yeah, let's tag me in some photos.
So the unit captures that time. Now, I could never have done that if manufacturers hadn't made miniatures that help my mind to capture that picture. And I think when you look at the unit, because it's still a functional unit of Saxon troops I use in games. So there's probably 3 or 4 different manufacturers of miniatures. So what I like to do is I like to look at the different ranges, and over time you get an understanding about, Perry's make a smaller 28mm miniature. They're usually quite slim. Foundry in their Viking and Saxon ranges are quite more chunky. Chunky. Front rank are a nice monkeys. Chunky looking miniature. So you learn what will go with each other, and these gripping beast guys who are wrestling fitted perfectly with these Foundry miniatures. And so I just started to pull them together, and in my mind the picture started, and then it was about, can I create a moment? And that's what I try to do. If the unit is all standing still and spearmen with their spears raised, well then why don't we mix that up? Why don't we have a couple that are talking to each other, or one that's sitting down, or a commander that seems to be giving instructions? And the War of the Roses one you refer to was about, I think it was the herald, the muso trumpet player, who I wanted. So it was almost like the commander was giving the order, sound the charge, sound the whatever signal, and he wanted to be heard, and he saw that there was a section there, so he stood up on the rock above the troops so that people would hear what he was doing. And that's the picture I've tried to create in that little unit of the herald doing his job, which was to herald, hey guys, we're about to do this. Oi! And that's it. And so he got to the point where his instrument would be heard above everything else. So yes, he does look higher than anything else in the unit, and it takes away from that lining up of spearmen that we've talked about. It's more of a fluid flowing unit when you see it, but it tells a story, and I've loved that. And that's what I love doing now more than anything, is telling a story in a normal unit of figures that I create for games.
Sure. And I think that's kind of like, that's definitely the next step on from like intermediate world, if you like, is taking those miniatures and maybe converting them or positioning them differently, or like you said, mixing different types of figures together to create something. And that's what I was getting at, is that I think the way you've done that in various ways, I think people could not really learn from it if you're just getting into that side of things. Where people often talk about, don't they, when you're doing command stands, creating these little vignettes, try and make them like a little think of them as little dioramas.
Command stand's the perfect place to start with that. And I think that's really important, because not a lot of skirmish rules don't allow you to create those functional bases where you might have 3, 4, half a dozen miniatures on a base that you can set up in a particular way.
Sure.
But a command stand often does. You can often have a commander on a horse, and then maybe a standard bearer standing next to him, and then maybe a musician, or even a dead body around. So you can create a little scene with a command stand, but if your figures are all individually based, it's more difficult to create those sorts of scenes.
I saw somebody, just side issue, I saw somebody who'd thought to create a little stand that was kind of like the refreshment barrel. So they'd imagined that, somebody had tipped, or they'd got like the wine barrel off the back of the cart. And there was 3 or 4 guys stood around it, just taking a drink with their armour off. They thought to create that.
Well, I think Ken, who you've interviewed already, and Gareth Lane, and a few of the other bods on Twitter are very good at creating those little vignettes. And those little vignettes around the table or in a game help to make the game. You know, I opened one of my drawers the other day, medieval drawers, and I'm looking at a drawer that's full of medieval peasants, and you know, tavern wenches and rat catchers, and I said, what are you doing with all this stuff you bought? But when I set up a medieval game and I have a little medieval town or a castle,
Yeah, you need some dudes in there. You need some wenches.
I put all those. Yeah. They look fantastic. They make the table. So
yeah, you need
like
some
that.
Dude with a sack and all that, and some guy with his grain and drinking out of it. Yeah.
They look good, and so never be afraid to create those little scenes, because you can use them in a million different ways.
Yeah, definitely. So that brings us on actually, kind of to the last question in this particular bit. Is there a project that you're most proud of, or something that you think, damn, that was good, or like if there was something that you were going to keep hold of if you had to lose everything else that you would keep?
Oh, what a terrible thought.
Yeah, exactly. But like, that's the thing I'm most proud of, that you look at it, you think, I'm damn happy with that. I think I really achieved something. Yeah,
I've often had that thought, because you know, I live in the Adelaide Hills, and the Adelaide Hills is famous for bushfires. And I often thought, if the fire was coming through, which army would I grab?
What would you have? Yeah. What are you going to chuck in it back?
Jesus. Well, this is the thing. It becomes quite difficult. Maybe pull a draw out and run with the draw.
Yeah.
I had a desire to create a nice Napoleonic army. I started in Napoleonics with British, and I learnt a lot by moving through that army and creating that army. But then I've always admired the French, and I wanted to do a French Guard division. And because I don't know why, maybe it's going back to those Airfix days and plastic figures.
Well, they look cool, but they look bloody cool.
The old guard and stuff. I think actually, when I think about it, the real thing with Napoleonics is that my grandmother took me to see the movie Waterloo when it came out.
Oh, wow.
I think I was 11. Yeah. And she said, "You sure you want to see that movie?" She was thinking it was a grown-up movie, but I don't know. I just was really interested in it, and I think that movie just changed my life. It just put things at a very young age in my mind about the Napoleonic period. So when I guess the army for me that I am proud of, and having said that, I would probably paint things a little bit differently now if I was to do it again, is my French Guard division of old Guard troops and beautifully coloured cavalry. I think for me, the time and the effort and the literally hours that I put in to try to make that army look, it was the army for me that I was going to show that I could paint, that I was going to actually put everything in and make a figure the best that it could possibly be for me. And I did that. And I think for me now, that's the one that I would grab in a fire or put out on display. But my War of the Roses army is just behind that. That is the thing to behold. Well.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
That's coming on nicely. But we evolve, you know. And I say I would do things differently. When I was painting that army, I painted eyes on figures. I no longer paint eyes on figures. I looked at Jim Ibbotson on Twitter.
Yeah, Jim Ibbotson. I think it's Ibbotson. Yeah. Harry Stockrasy.
Okay, so Harry Stockrasy.
I'm definitely going to ask if he'll do one of these, actually.
He never does eyes. And I thought, this guy's a bloody brilliant painter.
He's amazing, isn't he?
Yeah. And he doesn't paint eyes. And I remember him talking, he said, "Oh, don't worry, you know, there's such a small part of the face. You know." So I thought, why are you doing eyes, Stephen? Why are you painting these guys with googly eyes that look weird? They're very difficult to get. So I just stopped doing eyes. But my Grand Army has eyes, but I would probably not do those if I was to do those figures again. So you evolve, you change, your tastes change, the way you approach a figure changes. So understand that that's all part of the growth. It's all part of the learning. It's all part of who you are. And rather than look at your old miniatures, as I'm sitting here looking at these guys that I painted over 30 years ago, a lot of people go, "Oh, I couldn't use those on the table." Well, you can. You ought to be proud of the fact. Proud of the fact that this is where I started. This is where I am now. And you can actually see the evolution in front of you. You can see how you've developed and grown. and where you've come from. And I think that's an important part that we should be very proud of and praise. And that's one of the things, going back to what we talked. That's why I like to encourage newbies. It's those first miniatures are great, because that's where your level of skill is.
Yeah.
And don't ever be embarrassed by that, because that's an important part of your journey.
Yeah. And if you can, I always think as well, what I'd say to old me 3 years ago would be, don't be annoyed at those first 12 or 24, whatever it was, of painters, because you just painted 24 men the size of your thumb. And how many people do you know have got the intelligence and patience to do that?
That's exactly right.
Think of it that way.
That is exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, right. So some slightly more, well, not difficult questions, but they're slightly more unusual questions. I'm going to sort of trying. Part of this sort of series. I'm trying to delve a little bit into people's motivations for the hobby. Because there's absolutely no doubt that it is not a quick hobby. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's not something you can spend half an hour here, half an hour there on, well, you can do it that way, but if you do it twice a month, you'll get nowhere, kind of thing, if you want an army, you're going to have to sit and paint it. There's no way around that, is what, why do you think you do it? I mean, you're different to me in that you started pretty young. And have you never had a break, by the way? Have you pretty much painted and gamed more or less?
No,
or if you had long breaks?
I did have breaks. I think while I was doing my first degree and studying at college and stuff like that,
Sure.
yes, I did have breaks. And work gets in the way at times, and family gets in the way at times. There are always going to be times where it just doesn't suit where it doesn't suit. There's been breaks on and off. Maybe the longest went for just over a year, but that's, the good thing is you can come back. You know what I mean? It's not like you're out of it. Well, you just start again.
Yeah. But what overall, what do you get out of it? Why do you think you do it?
I think we touched on earlier about the escapism aspect for me. I love the research. I want to do 100 Years' War army. Well, Stephen, you live in Australia. What the hell do you know about the 100 Years' War? Well, not much. So I've got to look at some videos. I've got to look at some books. I learn about the colours. I learn about what they did, about the weapons they used, how they used them. Then when I'm lucky enough to go on a trip to the UK, I'll walk one of the battlefields. And so all the time behind the scenes, I'm growing and developing and learning and my understanding of that period and those troops and what they did and how they should look. And then that all comes back into my hands as I'm painting a miniature. All of those influences come together, and it helps me to create what I'm doing. So I just love that this hobby takes you into those parts of history which are just fascinating to me. But even if I'm painting some Space Marines or some Lord of the Rings goblins, it's the same thing. While there might not be a real historical link, but there is that losing of yourself into the research about these figures. Where are they from? What did they do? How did they function? How should they look? Why does that look like that? What colour should that be? It's that all-encompassing losing of yourself in what it is that you're doing that I find to be the most healthiest, the most beneficial, the most relaxing. Plus, wargaming sharpens our skills in a whole range of different areas.
It really does, doesn't it? Yeah. I didn't think of that when I first started. I just saw it as just painting some dudes and they were going to look cool, and that was it. I didn't realise I was going to have to understand colour and not become an artist. That's not fair, but to understand art to an extent,
Sorry, Siri's just going off here.
That's all right.
She
want to join in?
Something.
Maybe she's collecting the Napoleonic army and she wants to chip in.
I find her very annoying. But anyway, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Look, I've lost my train.
No, I was just saying.
Where were we
Just
going?
I was talking about you were talking about how you were talking about how the hobby ends up teaching you things or making you learn
Yes,
things that you
yes,
don't expect. What
yes.
surprised
Well,
you then? Is it what do you know? What are you now good at? That's not just painting, obviously, but that
well, I mean,
you're surprised
think
to.
about think about what you do. Think about what you have to learn to be a gamer. You, all of a sudden, you're faced with a table that's covered in different types of terrain, and so you just think you take for granted that you know what to do, but all of a sudden you learn that if I move that unit of knights into those woods, it's going to be a disaster because you've got these huge, heavy troops trying to negotiate through this tangled mess when they can, with a full armour on, they would be slow, they'd be jagged, they'd be just tripping over logs. It'd be a mess. It would be hopeless. So you learn this stuff. You learn, well, if I've got a troop that looks like this, what's the best sort of terrain that they can move through, and why is that so? And what happens to
Okay.
them when they go? So you learn about terrain. You learn about distances and line of sight. Could I see that person if they're over 100 yards away behind that stone fence? Or would that stone fence or that wheat field obscure them? So you learn about those things, about that. Well, how well do I see things at a distance? And what about if I was aiming a weapon over that type of distance and through that sort of terrain? How would that be affected? So you've got those whole line of sight things that you're learning. You're learning about how one type of troop functions against another type of troop. So let's just stay on the medieval theme. A knight is going to be fantastic in hand-to-hand fighting. Why? Because he's got a dirty, big, bloody weapon that he's been trained with. And secondly, he's covered in protective armour. So he's going to be really awesome when it comes to the pointing end of the game of doing what he has to do. But what is he going to be like against somebody that has only a tunic on, a bag full of stones for a sling or a bow and some arrows, and who can run around him 3 times before he can turn around and make his life really difficult if he's caught away from his mates, his fellow knights, when they all fight together shoulder to shoulder. That gives them their strength. What gives the skirmishers their strength is the fact that they are just so dispersed and that they move really fast and
Sure.
can run rings around these guys. So you learn this stuff. It just doesn't come naturally, but you then begin to understand, right, so if I throw my knight out there by himself, he's going to die. But if I leave him with his mates and they move together in a solid block, they're going to be a lot harder to deal with. So you learn that sort of stuff.
Sure.
The gaming process teaches you mathematics. It teaches you a whole range of different abilities and skills that you don't even realise you're using when you're there. Now, I grew up in
This is very
the
true.
business
Yeah.
in the business world, and you talk a lot about strategy and tactics. Gaming teaches you about strategy and tactics better than any business conference that you could ever attend. It teaches you about how those concepts, how are you approaching this game? What are you thinking about with this game? You've built an army to play this game. What do you want that army to do? And so you approach the game with a strategy in your head. I've built this army strongly. I've got some mounted troops. I really want those to work a flank. I'm going to see what the terrain is, and I'm going to put them on the flank that's going to allow me to exploit that, and I'll support them with my centre. So you go with a loose strategy. Your tactics of the game are that you learn that particular troops work well with each other. So I'm going to support my night block with some longbowmen and make sure that they've got some of that cover in case something that is too nasty gets too close. So you learn tactics, you learn strategy. You just start to do these things as a matter of course in a natural manner, and then you can apply those same skills to real life. There is a lot that the actual physical process of running a game and playing a game teaches you. And they are very tangible, real skills that are useful in every aspect of life that you use.
mean, something I've noticed as well. That's all very true. But something else I noticed is that if you're say there's 4 or 5 of you or whatever, and you think, right, let's do it. Let's do Waterloo. Oh my God, everyone panics first of all, but then you've got to organise yourselves, and you've got to sort of designate tasks and stuff, and you've got deadlines. It's particularly going to go and do it at a show.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, one of you's got to be a project manager effectively, because you've got who you want to build, and you've got this section. So who's going to do that? Who's going to do this? Where are we going to get that stuff from? So all of a sudden, it's almost like a project manager sort of thing as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is.
Which at the end of it is basically a massive toy soldier game, but there's a huge amount of expertise that goes into it, isn't there? Anyway,
so you're right. They just don't happen by themselves, and by putting young people behind figures on a table for a game, the stuff that they learn and the abilities that they can show that they might not have even known they had are amazing. And It's a great way to teach young people a whole range of different skills and different abilities.
Sure. Do you have, because I think it's fair to say that even if it's just through your photographs of things like and stuff like that, that you've inspired many people sort of over the internet, at least anyway, certainly. Do you have anybody who inspires you, who is either a painter or collector or gamer that you sort of look up to and are sort of inspired by in particular? Is there anyone in particular that stands out?
Look, there are many. I think we've mentioned a few of the guys that we see on Twitter from time to time. It's not difficult on Twitter to find really good miniature artists. And by really good miniature artists, I mean these guys that put hours into painting their miniatures, and they may only paint half a dozen miniatures, but those half a dozen miniatures are just award-winning museum pieces. They're absolutely lovely. There's many of those types of guys, I think, and I really admire them. I don't have that type of patience or skill. For me, I think the people that I admire even more are the people who can knock an army out.
Yeah.
The people who can, producing. Look at some of the 40K miniatures that you see come up on Twitter, and you look at them and you go, my God, that is just beautiful. And the guys laboured over it for 3 months, and you think you got one miniature.
Yeah.
I admire the people that will knock out a unit of miniatures and have an army to show for it after 3 months.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think with a lot of those 40K, that particular type you're talking about, they're probably not playing though. This is what I've discovered is all right. They've done this incredible Space Marine or whatever that you just think I could never paint that, and it looks incredible, but it's probably the only one they've got. so they're not gamers. Well, this is the thing to realise, is that they're not really gamers. Yeah.
And they'll win awards for it, and good on them, and they're beautiful. But I think in this hobby, what inspires me are the people that who can knock out. And you've shown this ability. You've got that ability just to sit down and to churn out figures.
I'm not that quick though. I still think I'm quite slow. I mean, I've been stick to the task, but you know.
Well, you're knocking those Saxons out pretty quick.
Yeah, that wasn't bad. How many of those were there? There are 40 in about, I don't know.
Yeah.
It still took about 3 weeks though.
I think that's pretty good. I think that's excellent.
Right.
If you've got, look, things get in the way. Life gets in the way of our painting. But if I'm left alone and I've got time, and this is when I was working, I could knock out a unit of probably 30 or 40 troops easily in a week But I was spending a fair bit of time behind the painting desk. I think to me it's those type of people that who like the Yorkshire Gamer and like Gareth and a lot of the Eccentric Man and a few of the other guys on Twitter. There's some lovely guys, Big Jim, and God, there's so many that are just really helpful. These guys push stuff out. They finish things. They get armies done, and I think that's what I admire.
Yeah, there's some people at the club one of whom is going to be in one of these interviews, who in the first 12 weeks of lockdown, he painted 1,000 miniatures.
Oh,
which is just nuts. I mean, he's retired, and that was what he was doing. Or he's at least semi-retired, but that's what he was doing. He was in lockdown at home, plenty of time. So he painted about 1,000 in the space of 12 weeks or whatever. 3 months.
That is incredible.
It's like
that is incredible.
It's like 300 a month, isn't it? Which is crazy, isn't it?
It is crazy.
And you're right that those are people to admire in a sense that the paint job he's done on them is good as well. You're right. They're not all like that one Warhammer figure, but they are bloody good standard. Like they are good standard. So yeah.
So inspiration can come from lots of different areas, and I think it's good to have some people that, I mean, like we talked about Jim. I think Jim is an amazing painter, but I don't think I could ever paint to his quality, but I love looking at what he does and how he does it, and I can learn from that. But so I have lots of different people that inspire me. I can't think of anybody off the top of my head that I would slavishly follow, but I might notice the way somebody does a shield or the way somebody does a face, and so I just pick up bits from different people.
Sure. So, as we sort of said before, you've been in this hobby for a long time now, and you've seen it from, well, you've seen all of its modern era, I suppose, really, in some ways, right from the sort of nadir of Games Workshop, the explosion of Games Workshop through to the modern day with the sort of the current era of plastics moving into bits of 3D printing and so on and so forth. Do you think the hobby's currently overall in a good place? I'm talking about historicals, really, rather than GW, because GW are arguably always in a good place. But well, they argue differently. But
I think the
historicals are in a good place. Do you think?
I think the variety we've got in historicals today is just unprecedented, and I think that puts us in a good place. I think for anybody starting in the hobby, there are a range of figures that you can go to, and easily you can get pretty much just about any period now in good plastic sets. And if you want to supplement those with some nice metal miniatures here and there, you can also get those readily. So as far as figures go and choice of figures, I don't think it's ever been better. The internet has given us the ability to have a community, so that whereas back when I was starting, community was your mates and those you had around you, or if you're in a club, they were the only people that saw your army. Now, I mean, here I am. I can remember you'd paint some figures and you'd take them to the club and you'd show the guy you were gaming at, and if he said, "Oh wow, they look nice," you were over the moon, because that's the only praise you probably would ever get for that. And then they'd be back in a box and under the bed. Whereas now you can put a picture of your miniature up and you can get hundreds of likes, and you put the picture up again 3 months and you get another couple of hundred. You get this repeated positive vibes, and I've never experienced this before, in the sense that you can share with such a wide community, worldwide community.
Lots of ways lots of places to find encouragement on there, I suppose.
And that is fantastic. So that is really, really different in that whole aspect. The guys who you get likes from South Africa and Canada and America and the UK and remote little Ireland. That's staggering. It's just the worldwide reach of this hobby now.
Sure. I mean, do you think the hobby's got any particular threats to it? I mean, there's one thing that I thought of, which I don't think it's probably not fair to describe it as a threat, but when the very first war game show I went to, which was 3 years ago now, just over, I think. I mean, I walked in and saw Perry Miniatures, the twins with their setup, and that's more or less the first thing I saw when I walked in the door. I was completely blown away by it, and I was blown away by everything else. Had a great day. People were really welcoming as well, because I bowled up to people and said, how do I get into this? Is there a starter kit? What? Oh, go and buy some of those. Go. Anyway, so I noticed all the positive things, and then the other thing I did note, I couldn't help but notice almost immediately, was that out of 1,000 people in the room, I was more or less the youngest. And at the time, I was in my mid-30s. I suppose you might call me in my late 30s now, but in my mid-30s, I was more or less the youngest person there. And the majority of those 1,000, the vast majority of those 1,000 people were men, and the vast majority of them were white. It's a really obvious demographic. I don't think I've ever seen a demographic quite so narrow for a particular sector.
Yes.
I don't think I've thought enough about it to have formulated an answer to this question. Really, maybe you haven't either. But does that matter? Is it something that is it something that we should be worried about?
I mentioned earlier that I'm a wargaming evangelist, and I think I go out of my way to get my young stepsons and sons-in-law and my girls' boyfriends and husbands. I've worked really hard to get them into the hobby, and they love it. They're really growing in the hobby in a big way. I really do think that we need to be conscious of bringing young people into this hobby. It's easy to be a group of old bastards sitting around and enjoying a game, but we need to be able to learn how to share what we do and how we do it. Games Workshop are really good at this.
They are.
Games Workshop, I think their demographic is a 14-year-old or something, or maybe a bit younger. And so pretty much everything they do is marketed at that sort of an age group, and they do bring in young people really well. Yeah. And when we think about it, a lot of us started in the gaming world through those fantasy realms and or sci-fi realms, and therefore it is a natural progression to come from those areas of gaming and to begin to dabble them with historical stuff. I think what we need to be conscious of is making those pathways really easily identifiable for young people. So, go and enjoy yourself in the Games Workshop world. By all means, it is just absolutely fantastic, and you learn so many good skills and so much about the hobby. But we need to make sure that the pathway that a young person can see into historicals is clear, is easy, and that they can make that transition across, and they can go to and fro as often as they want. But there is a pathway for them. And the way we set our clubs up, the way we present our games, the way we present ourselves means that those pathways will be successful or not. And those pathways are the same for female gamers. There are many, many more that are coming into the hobby, but many fantastic female painters on Twitter. And that seems to be an extremely interesting area for them. They seem to love the painting very, very much, and they've discovered that they can bring their own feel to a whole range of different figures, and they do a fantastic job with the way that they interpret colour, and the way that they approach it is fantastic. But if we want to keep young people and we want to see more ladies in our hobby, we have to make sure that the transition across to historical gaming is clear, is easy, is understandable, is welcoming, is friendly, and which is why you're doing what you're doing now with this podcast. Is these pathways have to be identifiable. If we just want to sit in our club and not share, then we will never see any growth.
Sure. The reason I asked the question, you're right. The reason I asked the question is because I thought, because I was sitting here the other day and I thought, I've just passed my 3rd year anniversary, basically. And I just thought, I was looking at, all the lads, as I call them, they're in a cupboard at the end of the utility room. And occasionally when I'm bored, I'll just open the cupboard just for looking good. And I don't know what I expect to see in there. It's the same stuff, Anyway, but I was looking at them the other day and I was just like, geez, there's loads of them now.
That's right, there are.
Oh my God, there's like 500 in there or something now, And
good.
And I thought to myself, I can't believe that I've managed this, because when I started, There's no club near me really, not really. The nearest club to me was very small. It was a very small number of people that I went to once and didn't go back before I found Mansfield. And really, the only way I could get started was online, really, to begin. And then I went to the show and stuff, and I noticed that there was lack of kids and lack of anyone my age, and I sort of thought, well, is this not a ticking time bomb? Potentially, I don't think it is, because I've discovered that the number of people that are into the hobby is stable, if not growing. Historicals. That's what it seems like that to me anyway. It's stable and probably growing. But I'm a bit like you in an ideal world, nearly everybody would be into it. I don't think that's ever going to happen.
No.
But I like to think that nearly everybody has a way in if they want it. So that's the reason I asked the question: is there not, if some sort of concerted effort isn't made to create that bridge and to make things easier, then is the hobby not putting itself at risk longer term, long term?
I think manufacturers also have a place to play, and many of them do this really well. Also, is they need to create products that are appealing to a younger market, and many of them do. I think Warlord Games has done an amazing job in the way that it's just promoted the hobby, expanded the hobby, the ranges they bring out. They've done an amazing job, and I think it's very easy for a young person coming from that Games Workshop background and to see a company like Warlord Games. There's a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
So there's that pathway. It's nice and clear and easy, and I think we help that where we can through our clubs. If we do open days in our club where we would build public displays and people walk past.
I've seen pictures of
gaming table.
Yeah. They're great. Yeah.
So that works really well. But I think we also need to use our, which is one thing the internet is great for, is that this community that is online is also part of that encouragement. It's also part of that process of helping people that they may be buying their first miniatures and putting them up online for someone to see. And that encouragement we give, that building them up, the offering of advice, that's all part of this process. So it's all intermingled. It all works together. But I guess it comes back to each individual gamer. And this might be a mindset that comes with maturity. But I think we all have an obligation where we can to promote what we do and to help other people who are commencing to get started. And if they're younger people, let's do what we can to help them. And provide opportunities where they can show their stuff and, get some feedback.
Brilliant. Well, that was really good advice. I think that's a sensible place to end it, I think. We've been chatting for ages. So we'll say thanks very much to Stephen. All the way down there in Australia. I think, are you going to go and have your breakfast now? Or you already had your breakfast?
Well, I was just looking. I didn't realise it was 9 o'clock.
I know. We were talking for ages. Yeah, it's 9 o'clock. For people that don't know, by the way, people won't realise this, but it's 10:30. No, it's not. It's after midnight in the UK.
Oh God!
But for Stephen, it is. It's just after 9 a.m. in the morning. So thank you ever so much for your time. I hope people enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I certainly did.
I have. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, and there's a few more of these to come yet, and there's an idea floating around in my head that maybe one day we'll get a few masters on one interview together. That might be quite an interesting chat, wouldn't it? So yeah, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, and we'll see you for another masters interview soon. Thanks, Stephen.
Bye bye.